Pseud podcast with me, Maestro, Teapot, Brig, Jericho, and two other guests. We are the main hosts, so to speak. Teapot, the musician from Sweden, and with anger problems sometimes because he's angry. He's always an angry teapot. And
that's
of
not
course, and there is Jericho, of course, the big Jericho, big man, professional locksmith, and hacker man, Kaczynski extraordinaire. And of course, Brig, big brain, and my future collaborator when we're gonna do our Deleuze and Guattari redux together.
And I'm Morvil, professional English person.
Perfect. And not only that, gentlemen, because we also have sponsors today. Yes, the third episode of this podcast is sponsored by the Ministry of State Security of China. Remember, they are watching you, even through Discord, especially through Discord. And of course,
they are. China is selling us the future, bro.
Bro.
Yeah, China's going to sell us the future right now. That's why we haven't been deleted thus far.
It's Tencent. Also, another special sponsor is Big Bill Hell's Cars, who was so generous that we are going to play their ad today for your pleasure. Enjoy.
Fuck you, Baltimore! If you're dumb enough to buy a new car this weekend, you're a big enough schmuck to come to Big Bill Hell's Cars. Bad deal. Cars that break down. Thief. If you think you're gonna find a bargain at Big Bill, you can kiss my ass. It's our belief that you're such a stupid motherfucker. You'll fall for this bullshit. Guaranteed. If you find a better deal, shove it up your ugly ass. You heard us right. Shove it up your ugly ass. Bring your tray. Bring your title. Bring your wife. We'll fuck her. That's right. We'll fuck your wife. Because at Big Bill Hell, you're fucked 6 ways from Sunday. Take a hike to Big Bill Hell. Home of challenge pissing. That's right, challenge pissing. How does it work? If you can piss 6 feet in the air straight up and not get wet, you get no down payment. Don't wait, don't delay, don't fuck with us or we'll rip your nuts off. Only at Big Bill Hell, the only dealer that tells you to fuck off. Hurry up, asshole. This event ends the minute after you write us a check. And it better not bounce or you're a dead motherfucker. Go to hell. Big Bill Hell's Cars, Baltimore's filthiest and exclusive home of the meanest sons of bitches in the state of Maryland. Guaranteed.
Well, ain't that the truth, Big Bill? Well, I'd recommend strapping yourself in because it's going to be one hell of a ride. We're going to dig deep into what is basically the world ending, right, as we know it. Everything proving Francis Fukuyama wrong in any shape, way, or form. Maybe proving him right about his new book about identities. And what we could do here, right? We could go into every single conflict. Chile, Bolivia, there's so many examples here. I'm looking through the latest Amnesty Press paper, and I mean, there's not enough time for us to actually go through every part. So instead, we decided to go over the abstract. Why is this shit happening? Do you want to go on to that, Brig?
Yeah.
What's going on in the world?
There's a variety of reasons. I wanted to make a snarky comment real quick, and I said, as opposed to talking about those conflicts, let's create our own. Let's get Francis Fukuyama on here, and if he says, or if he tries to defend the end of history to my face, I will beat him in. I will make sure his skull is caved in. So, that comment aside, there's a variety of reasons a lot of these protests and so forth are occurring. I mean, one only needs to really look at how neoliberalism has conducted itself within the last 20 years, and I've discussed neoliberalism to some degree, but this is a more political-focused and political science-focused discussion of it as opposed to it being philosophical, which it was last week. And, you know, we all agreed that we wanted to discuss Hong Kong because that was relevant, but also with Chile and with Colombia and with all the other situations that are occurring in the world, you know, there's a reason and there's a cause you have to think of. Why precisely is this occurring? Why is there a large degree of protest within the world when neoliberalism had purported to have consolidated itself? And, well, let's look at the histories of, you know, Chile or Hong Kong, for instance. The instances, or at least within Chile, of democracy being successful and there being a civil society which is conducive to the functioning of democracy, there has been virtually no improvement whatsoever within Chile. Chile still uses the Chicago model of economics, which Pinochet implemented, And yes, to some degree, it was successful within the 1990s, but the implementation of neoliberalism in a lot of these countries with a dearth of resources, besides one, copper being Chile's primary example and electronics being Hong Kong's primary example, and even Algeria with, I believe, Algeria exports steel, and that was their primary reliance upon economic conduct and upon creating profits. Neoliberalism thus far is proving incapable of solving a lot of the crises and a lot of the issues which arise within the world. And obviously there's a variety of reasons for it, but I would primarily put it down to neoliberalism still functions within a worldview and horizon where it does not allow any sort of plurality to exist within politics. And I know Maestro would like to comment on this, since him and I had a discussion about this only a few days ago concerning this, but primarily the conduct and implementation of neoliberalism thus far is incapable of understanding the social thought of other countries. It still treats nation states as the primary actors within the global market, but as people like Samuel Huntington, who is a contemporary of Francis Fukuyama, point out, we're not living within a 20th century paradigm anymore. We don't live within the context of nation states anymore. To treat economics and world politics as still being bound by the Westphalian Order, which, if you don't know about the Treaty of Westphalia, that's really conceived as the first instance where nations acted as nations as opposed to representing kings. And so, for instance, in the Treaty of Westphalia, with the Protestant and the Catholic leagues, for instance, kings did not represent themselves. This was no longer a struggle between just kings who were supposed to represent their countries. A lot of times, places like France, they had Cardinal Richelieu, who is a cardinal at the time, who represented King Louis XIV on the matter of that, but he also represented France. So the instance of it, in what I'm at least articulating of what Samuel Huntington said, is we're not living in a nation-state paradigm anymore. We don't need to conceive of politics in this manner. We're living in a civilizational state paradigm. And I introduce this right now because this is vital for our discussion of Hong Kong, which will come subsequent in the succeeding discussions and the succeeding points.
Adding to the point, also I wanted to present that the reality of the thing is what as Brig presents. It presents this world of superpowers, of megapowers, which act on a different level, on a different strategical, diplomatical level. But the thing is, the system, the process of the system, of the neoliberal system, is so entrenched into it's fundamentally a part of the neoliberal system. It's so entrenched into that liberal process of powers, of nation powers, that it still tries to force today politics to work on a Bismarckian level, so to speak, in regards to the political relationships which are had today. This, of course, causes tensions, because the reality of things is that right now, and that's one of the reasons, for example, for the protests, because the stability of the neoliberal system is as stable as its trade system is, which is extremely fragile nowadays, with the United States being on the brink probably of getting out of the World Trade Organization any day right now, and in general, international organizations being not as applicable as they were some years ago. It's becoming very much more difficult to imagine a neoliberal world managing to maintain itself stable if it does not have its trade as stable one. And it cannot be turned back. We already talked about the idea of turning back being completely moronic, so to speak.
So, Wendy, do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, so I very much agree with all that is just said, but I also think there's a part of it here that has to do with the legacy of imperialism. And I think that a lot of the fucking up that imperialism did to generations of people, the effects of that are being seen now. So now those people that were probably children during the times of like the height of neo-imperialism, especially like look at the countries involved, like Bolivia, Chile. These are countries that experienced that height of American imperialism. And I think that the generations that were like quite young during this time are now getting to that age where they are comparing the rest of the world and what they were told they deserved and how they're experiencing this reality, and realizing how fucked things are because of how things shook out in that imperialist framework. So I think that's also got a big part, as well as neoliberalism. And those, neoliberalism and imperialism tend to go hand in hand.
Oh yeah, definitely. Brigadeiro, reply to that.
Yes, I mentioned this in the preceding podcast, but for the sake of our audience, I will jog their memory with it and remind them of what I said. But the way that neoliberalism conducts itself in the implementation of liberal democracies in parts of the world where, as I mentioned, social thought is not adequate, or where there's no history of having individualism being the primary conducting agent within a social framework, or an inability for the people to really have a form of education which allows them to be informed and aware of their politics. It goes about imposing, as Sweyn said, a form of imperialism, but we don't even need to treat it necessarily as imperialism, because living in the modern context of the world economy, any sort of trade interaction can be conceived as imperialism if you take the traditional paradigm on it. So it's not necessarily a valid form of analysis. Yes, for a Marxist, obviously, analyzing X, Y, or Z country is completely fair to say it's imperialism because you are using a Marxist paradigm, but we're operating within a 21st century where the left is primarily impotent and incapable of organizing itself right now. So we're going to need new tools of analysis and new tools in order to understand the social interactions of it. And so what I'm proposing precisely to do this is treating neoliberalism as an attempt by the West to impose itself, not only in the form as it did of imperialism, where it had explicitly hard and soft power, but now it tries to do itself within concepts and within institutions. So if one can, examine or look towards, for instance, the World Bank or the World Trade Organization, there are certain stipulations for entering these organizations. Same with the European Union, of course. For instance, one needs to have a liberalized economy in order to join the World Bank. One cannot have a primarily centralized or structured economy, because that is not conducive to what the World Bank expects the free market to be, which is multilateral global free trade primarily. And so that's why China has primarily liberalized, but it has not politically liberalized because it is pushing the boundaries on it. Whereas in relation, the European Union explicitly stipulates that a country has to be democratic. And obviously, we're seeing the issues with this right now because countries like Poland, countries like the Czech Republic, countries like Slovakia, countries like Romania or Serbia, where there is no precedence whatsoever for democracy. And I would argue that fundamentally, the notion of how Western individualism is conducted is antithetical to the entire Polish spirit. And thus, we're seeing a deconsolidation, if you will, of neoliberalism, precisely on the basis that it expects the world especially to have a francophone or anglophone tendency of understanding how the individual is structured, whereas that is not conducive or correlates whatsoever with reality as a whole. To treat certain countries, for instance, Chile, as possessing the necessary social thought, the necessary educational, economic, healthcare, the entire superstructure, as Marxists would call it, that is conducive and capable of supporting democracy as a base is completely absurd. And thus, that is primarily why a lot of these instances occur. For example, is an attempt is made at implementing neoliberalism. And I did a paper on this within Africa, where countries like Kenya or countries like Uganda attempt to try to implement neoliberalism, and a lot of the times certain racial tendencies are exacerbated because one group is favored over another. One only needs to refer to the Rwandan genocide to see primarily how that turns out. So the issue is, even in the post-colonial condition, in the attempt to try to use certain groups or a abstract notion of a nationality among certain groups, it is not conducive whatsoever because, for instance, in Kenya, the British chose a certain group to represent and to lead over the other African peoples which existed there. And obviously, to try to make this into a nation state or even a civilizational state is very, very difficult. And so in places like Chile especially, there is a complete contrast between what you would conceive of as Chileans or primarily Spanish-based people and the natives who are primarily being pushed out. Same with Bolivia right now, in fact. With the coup that just happened, there is a certain reaction by one group to another group. So I would say, as the overarching theme of these analyses, and I'll obviously try to go into this later, but for this particular point, neoliberalism is incapable of approaching the nuances and social fragmentation which exists within certain peoples, and it tries to impose an order, and this order is often not capable of being used or utilized in a way conducive to people. So what inevitably happens if that country is not capable of attaining 4% growth per year, or of raising the poverty, or of actually focusing on poverty alleviation? Well, there's obviously mass protest. And usually what happens, there's a dictatorship or a reversal of it. And so neoliberalism fails once again in that country. I mean, obviously, a country like Chile, one only needs to look what happened with the attempt by Allende and then the subsequent leader who came after that, Augusto Pinochet.
No, yeah.
That was a lot of information, but you had something to reply to that, right?
No, yeah. I agree a lot with this shit, especially within the context of Africa. The similar thing happened. I'm from South Africa, and under the apartheid model, what the government did was they separated different homelands, and it's like, okay, your people are more important here, and the Zulu group, they wanted to keep their power. They wanted apartheid to stay because they had that power there. So it's interesting how in this framework, that's even in systems where racially you're treated as inferior, that democracy still is just not viable because it's a better way for you to organize your people. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, there are multiple approaches to kind of explain these, like the manifestation of these protests, and depending on the geographical location and the time and the context of their history, et cetera, et cetera. But honestly, like, especially the latest couple of months, I've had this kind of itch, not in the sense that, well, I need to put a bomb on, like, get used to it, but I kind of want to directly target it. And it's the question of the word liberalism. It's been digging at me for a long time, but I mean, often I go on some community and I see it. I hear people talk about capitalism, talk about liberalism, talk about specifically neoliberalism. And I mean, as Marxists, like, it's almost like it's a meaningless term at this point, but it has more prevalence than ever, especially in the context of these protests. But at the same time, what does it actually mean? Like, you have the word neo, like new, and liberalism, which bases on, John Stuart Mill, John Locke, and Adam Smith. And before, I want anyone replying to this and scratching my annoying itch, I want to say that this idea, because we already know what it kind of means, right? You take away the social responsibility to a certain extent. You have monetarism based on Friedman and Chicago School of Economics, and you rely on private enterprise to fix a lot of these issues. Unions get kind of pushed out, and you lower taxes. You could almost, depending on how you implement it, it's like a shock therapy, as Naomi Klein would point out.
Trickle-down economics, bud. Trickle-down economics.
Well, it sure is.
Wait for the honey to drip.
It's all trickling down, all right? But, I mean, the main point to recognize is that this has always been a part of liberalism. But at the same time, the state was also a part of liberalism. You can't just take it away and expect the structure to work, right? That wouldn't be neoliberalism. Even Friedman understood this, right? He sees himself as the follow-up to Adam Smith. and that like the state should have some responsibility, not in a Keynesian way or any kind of interventionist manner, but just to control the money, right? And I'm not sure if that what the people are meaning, but that's the reality we have today. We still have state-powered capitalist nations. They just operate differently. So what do people actually mean by neoliberalism? I really feel like we need to be honest about this before we can move on and build anything beyond that base.
Yeah, I mean, like, let's put it this way. Let's put it in some historical context first from neoliberalism to understand where it comes from. And for me, neoliberalism, if one goes into history, I mean, talking about 1980s and such, for me, neoliberalism is a war measure. It was a war measure made by the West to counteract and completely put down the opposition which was made by the system of state capital, socialism, communism, call it whatever you want, by the system from the East. By the system from the East, which had its own difficulties, but it posed a challenge. The United States found themselves constantly in trouble, being challenged by this system, so to speak. And neoliberalism, in some ways, was this kind of revival of those which made the core aspects of the Americana, of the true Americana way of life, and it was like some sort of emergency measure which proved effective. It put in like the increase in military spending, the economic pressure increase, put on the knees the Soviet Union, and was one of the reasons why the Soviet Union dissolved. But the thing is, since it was a war measure and it was implemented basically by essentially what was an actor, so basically a proto-Trump in regards to his knowledge and capacity for state craftsmanship, which Reagan was an actor from Hollywood mostly, like that's people who most...
Oh, yeah.
So you end up with having a war measure which became so ingrained that we are still living in this kind of war regime. But make no mistake, there is no ideal liberalism which we can go towards. We already talked, I think, in the past podcast about the idea of desiring to reach the ideal. When you desire to reach the ideal, you're going to have horrible things happening to you. It can be from the trivial about creating a idealized image of something or somebody which you don't want, like in the end is not that person, and you can hurt that, or to even the fucking Holocaust, because that's the reaching of an ideal. Like, and yeah, I might be exaggerating here, and it can be considered a bit, but we need to be careful in regards to how we view towards the world, even from a philosophical aspect. And we need to understand that what we have currently is basically scrapped up ideological soup, which served mostly to combat the Soviet Union as an emergency measure, and it's still present today in some manner because, I mean, there is nothing else that opposes it.
Yeah, like it is very important, like how we view the world, at least that we're honest about it. And I mean, while I do have my qualms with the way Zizek views not really democracy, but like ideas of localized planning or whatever, I find his approach a little bit vulgar at times. But I do find myself agreeing with him quite a lot. And in this context, I feel as if you do not really kind of not pretext, but if you look at things from a certain perspective, to like kind of build a platform and talk about these ideas, whether it's like Marxism or when you're talking about Samuel Huntington or Fukuyama, like the Fukuyamist worldview, if you're just looking at it like that and you're not caring about the linguistics, you're just using ideas, I don't think that's any better than what like naive realism, right? Because the idea that you could just look at things for what they are and say, well, I'm not ideological, right? I'm not a Marxist or liberal or whatever, as fucking this hippie from the 80s. He used to do a lot of acid, but there's this idea that we're just dumb monkeys, all these ways of thinking, just stay in the present, forget about history, forget about Hegel and all that shit. Like that kind of mentality, it is pure ideology to a certain extent. Everything as a baseline is based on ideology. At that point, I agree with you, Jacques, right? But that's where the confusion ends and begins, I feel. I would like to say that modern liberals are more self-aware than its critics, and especially from the radical left, especially in the United States. And what we're seeing is an authentic movement. It is not just people being, like pure ideology, like trying to represent some higher moral ideal. No, they are truly suffering. They're not just rising up for the sake of rising up. You can make the argument in with the yellow vests or whatever, but that's not the same case with Hong Kong, even though it started like that. So I just want to make sure that we're not putting everything into one sack of potatoes, right? Like if we're gonna be honest about this, then I think we should be abstract, but we shouldn't put all these different contexts all together. So again, I'll let you go on with your point, Brig, and hopefully I didn't disturb your train of thought with that.
No, you didn't whatsoever. I think it's actually very, very valid what you just said, especially for most people. Within political science especially, people who are very, very critical of neoliberalism, they tend to take it as this abstract notion, and they don't even do it necessarily in the same degree. They treat neoliberalism in the same abstraction which neoliberals tend to do with themselves, where they try to treat history as being a balance of transcendence and immanence. And Maestro and I joked about this before, but really looking into it from that perspective, it's almost fascinating how neoliberalism managed to function as well as it does with how it tends to think. So you mentioned the aspect of naive realism, where you don't want to be focused on Hegel. You don't want to be focused on the process of history. Let us do the thinking on Hegel and history and macroeconomic policies. Just focus on enjoying yourself. By nature, neoliberalism had to do that because it was a response to Keynesianism, as Maestro had said. So I want to give a bit of a historical context in a way Maestro didn't do so that it's relevant to the modern contextualization we're trying to consider, but also some of the issues and how people conceive of neoliberalism as being this great monolith, for instance. So
my place as a historian is being usurped.
So neoliberalism, as a reaction to Keynesianism, wanted to go back to a form of oversight and social organization which necessitated more and more social cohesion and less reliance upon state apparatuses or upon technocrats or experts to manage the nuances of the domestic market. And it primarily arose not only in the 1980s, but as Maestro said, it was a Cold War phenomena. Usually you can look at America to this, but also in things like the Marshall Plan and in the construction of post-war Europe, a lot of these neoliberal policies were implemented. And you can look at, for example, West Germany and how they attempted to implement a form of new social organization, which saw less and less concentration upon state bureaucrats, which had become so endemic, so Bismarckian, as Maestro had said, of how German people function. And now it became less and less decentralized. So that was a tendency of neoliberalism. And it really found its intensity in the 1980s, and how we conceive of neoliberalism was really formulated through that, because it wasn't just a simple dichotomy of, oh yeah, well, we stress upon free market capitalism, upon free expression, upon an ability and a constitutional guarantee that you can think whatever you want, even though obviously the implementation never truly was as open as they pretended to be. And all of these benefits were presented to the world. But by the 1980s, there was less and less countries becoming democratic. In fact, even though people like Samuel Huntington in political science tends to conceive of the post-coronation revolution as being the kicking off, if you will, of the third wave of democracy, which we're starting to see the recession of slowly, there was less and less democracies really being formulated, and more people that were once democracies becoming democratic. And why is that primarily? Because in the 1980s, with the intensification under Gorbachev and Reagan of the Cold War, America tried to assert itself more and more in the traditional paradigm of a superpower structure, as opposed to how it acted in the 1960s and the 1970s, where, yes, it was obviously conceived of as, the great superpower of NATO, but it didn't act that way. It tried to go into countries and help them less as a imperialist or as a dominating power, and it tried to show that democracy was beneficial, which democracy is trying to do now. But that is primarily where neoliberalism originated. It was a reassertion of the United States as the primary power, and even in the 1990s, this was intensified by people like Fukuyama and Samuel Huntington really up until the mid-2000s when he reversed that process. And so, now, what are the issues in conceiving of neoliberalism as this great monolith, as AngryTeapot so astutely and eruditely pointed out as being a not necessarily phenomena, but being as a improper conceptual understanding of it? Well, obviously, in neoliberalism, it's very hard to conceive of a proper political engagement from a point of immanence without referring to, as I mentioned, that transcendental property. So with AngryTeapot mentioned, for instance, liberalism originating with people like John Locke and the Enlightenment and a lot of the English philosophers that existed within the Enlightenment at this time.
Like Carl Benjamin?
Yeah, sure.
You read Locke once.
Sure. But let me tell you, the issue of conceiving it in this perspective is that democracy became more and more reliant on, yeah, we can give you freedom. Yeah, we can make you rich. Yeah, we can, boost poverty alleviation. But the process and the issue that neoliberalism is facing is that not only in critics treating it as a monolith, but also neoliberals themselves treating it as this great monolith, as this great ideological dominator, if you will, that managed to overcome fascism, communism, the various forms of socialism that tried to exist. And it's even trying to assert itself now over China as being, the quote unquote primary authoritarian capitalist model, which is the conceived enemy of neoliberalism now. In treating itself as a monolith, it has so many issues, not only domestically, but geopolitically, in how it treats people, that this is why we're seeing it conceived as a monolith failing. But a lot of the critics, as AngryTeapot mentioned before, of neoliberalism, the failings and the shortcomings they're seeing of this, they see it as though neoliberalism will collapse tomorrow, when in reality, neoliberalism won't collapse. If America still exists, and if the core countries, as we call them, so places like Canada, the US, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Spain, for instance, if those countries still are able to maintain their democratic systems, even in a illiberal form. So this is meant to negate the premise that, the populist movements are going to bring us back to fascism. No, feasibly they aren't. They're not capable of organizing themselves in a way which is able to overcome the traditional democratic parties while also still being able to consolidate power there. So they will be illiberal as opposed to fascist, as most people tend to conceive of it. So the issue of this is, if those core countries still exist, neoliberalism will exist, but it won't be as exported as it is in the degree which it is. I think I mentioned last time that it is almost Trotskyist in how it conceives of politics being this great, we need to get this country to be just like this. We need to get this country to be like this. And so it's being forced into a dilemma, which obviously I can't answer right now because time is not shown, where it becomes a matter of quantity, as the United States seems to conceive of, we need Afghanistan and Iran and all of these different countries, as I mentioned before, who are not capable of the social thought for democracy to become democratic, or it's going to be focused on quality in order to try to combat, other economic models and the plurality which is starting to occur of places like China or Hong Kong or Singapore, all of these countries which can offer a lot of the same tangible benefits that neoliberalism does without having to refer to that transcendental perspective of, yes, you will get your universal rights, but you have to bear through this suffering in order to get to it.
So, yeah, definitely. Like, the idea of just bearing it through, I feel that's kind of what everyone, I would say, is experiencing it right now. If anything, right, if there's a universal experience that's going on right now, not even as an ideological movement, but just as a kind of, how should I put it, a big mood, right? Kind of a vibe. What's currently is, I wouldn't say struggle necessarily, but I would say we're approaching a kind of boiling point, right? And I wouldn't say it's as obvious what this boiling is leading up to or what is heating it up. But the experience is pretty universal. Here's the thing though, right? What if we just slow down a little bit, take a deep breath, and completely go 180 on this, right? What if the opposite was true, right? And I mean it quite, not literally, but I'm saying, what if instead of we already having like just a stability, we've reached global capitalism, and sorry, someone might join. I got a little bit off track there, but global capitalism, we've reached, we have property, we have quote unquote freedom or consumerism or whatever you want to call it. And we have some kind of a safety net. We've kind of responded to positive freedoms like access to education. We have somehow incorporated human rights into nearly every liberal democracy. But here's the thing, right? We're not approaching fascism just like Brigadeiro said. Like, I completely agree with you on that one. We are approaching something a lot worse than fascism. And I wouldn't call it a full submission to neoliberal capitalism. Rather, I would say it's a reaction to something approaching hysteria, right? So it's reactionism from both parts. It's no longer about liberty. It's no longer about human dignity. It's about kind of, maybe the Joker did it better. And I don't want to belittle the rising ups in Chile. I think they're still struggling against something quite authentic. But my point is, perhaps we're looking a little bit too much at the protests. Maybe there is a reason that medias have been focusing on these very direct conflicts and consequences, because that's what brings in the numbers, right? But maybe in like 10 years, 20 years, we'll have a completely different perspective of it. Because what is going on? It's not just a boiling up of people's temper, like a very negative mood. And it's not just fascism. Instead, what I think is that people are generally not only losing hope in democracy, but they're kind of losing their potency, their passion, as like Fukuyama would point it out. And it's not, this time, it's no longer in the way of liberalism. It's in the way of any authentic program whatsoever, depending on your context. I'll take my country as a perfect example, right? 10 years ago would be completely inconceivable to have a a nationalist party in the parliament. People were crying, people were freaking out. 1/4 of our population thinks the nationalist party is the best one right now to solve our country's problems. We're not uneducated. We're not all mentally ill, though it might seem like that. We're not suffering through a major economic crisis. I would say people are becoming a lot more cynical, a lot more confident in their cynicism. And this reaction to hysteria of social media, of quote unquote cancel culture, it's a lot more emotional than you would expect, but they're not stupid. They know what they're doing. And what they're doing is kind of coming to terms with the fact that as not only individuals, as influencers, these conflicts that we're experiencing with different countries and the very language that we're using, it's a dangerous game, right? And the worst part about living in a country with privileges and being a politician is that it often is the case that when you're doing something that feels right, feels ethical. You have all the data behind you, whether it's like ecological movements with Greta Thunberg. More than often we've seen in history, this leads to political violence, destabilization. And I don't think most people who oppose immigrations are monsters, but they're afraid of not the entire situation boiling over and turning into communism or fascism, but that things cannot go on. And that's the main point that I think we've reached. It's that the way things are right now, they cannot go on. We cannot solve it by simple debate, by simple parliamentarianism. There seems to be no easy way out. So there is some kind of a rational cynicism towards liberal democracy at its core. And there is no radical solution that people are willing to put up a fight for. And I'm not sure that we could give it justice by like trying to point at people's confusion, some coming economic crisis. I think this is more than an economic crisis, more than some like hippie spiritual crisis of the individual or whatever. We're really fucking confused. And I think it's all right to be confused.
And to be less confused.
But what is not all right,
to be less confused, we again have our sponsors, Big Bill, Hell's Cars, which will allow you to escape the confusion of reality, existence, and enter pure immanence. Right now we're entering the beauty of the aesthetics of this kind of crisis, the beauty of the collapse, the beauty of
there is no escape from these Frankenstein radio controls.
Exactly.
Allow me to respond, since I wanted to respond to a lot of what he said before we get into the aspects of aesthetics, because aesthetics are very important to this. But I want to at least examine, because AngryTeapot mentions a lot of what I personally advocate for, and really to summarize it, politics has properly given into the postmodern condition at this point. And when he mentions the reactionary tendencies and the flailing against complete unknowns, for instance, that is precisely what philosophy experienced in the late 1960s and the early 1970s. And even now, it's still trying to impose a sense of coherence and order to philosophy again, which I would argue is virtually incapable of ever occurring whatsoever, just because philosophy has reached another stage. And so what I wrote down, for instance, as a possible side thought or as a possible thought for this conversation was that we're moving away from these great and overarching, I call it an aggrandized structural politics, if you will, where neoliberalism, it was presented as rosy. It was going to complete history. It's going to complete racism, sexism, misogyny, inequality.
Your relationship with the wife.
Yeah, every conceivable issue that existed. And we're moving into a post-structural politics, and I know, as Deleuze mentioned, and I think he's at least good for conceiving this for our audience, is that capitalism has properly become schizophrenic, but the politicians have not. And so I also noted, for instance, that there's a complete contrast within this conflict that exists now, and in this confusion which occurs between the West and the reliance upon political leaders as being relatable. You're supposed to be able to look at them and say, wow, that's just like me. Wow, he's eating a hamburger at McDonald's. Something which is relatable and something wherein you can grasp the power and the dynamics which exist in it in a way where you feel comforted within it. Whereas when you look towards people like Park Chung-hee or, Chung Do-hwan or, Kwan Yu Lee and all of these different technocrats and authoritarians which exist, you don't see that. Even Deng Xiaoping, he was made into being this lovable character, but if you've ever read anything Deng Xiaoping wrote, he was very cold and impersonal. Same with Xi Jinping, for instance. So we're seeing this great contrast, if you will, between the West, which is still focused on a sentimentality of political governance, and upon the East, which is focused on getting results done. And that obviously goes not only into the social thought category that I mentioned, but it's the demonstration that neoliberalism is incapable of resisting the postmodern condition as much as it struggles. And this is why it may be no surprise. People like Francis Fukuyama, they're getting into philosophy now. They are trying to argue against the various horizons which could overcome neoliberalism. For instance, Francis Fukuyama has many books on the concept of AI, or upon transhumanism, or even upon a reversal of neoliberalism into this, as I call it, pragmatic idealism, where yes, you have this great conception in your mind of, well, this is what I want my country to be like, but you're not limited by a structure to get to that place. So, as I mentioned before, people like Park Chung-hee come to mind for this. Park Chung-hee, he wanted to industrialize South Korea. How did he go by that? Well, he used many policy mechanisms, and he used a variety of even innovative ways to industrialize a country. Most of them would be conceived as unethical on this horizon, but as I mentioned before, really a postmodern condition or a post-structural politics does not account for the traditional mechanisms and the traditional stability and sense of confidence which it had so relied upon. And that's why, as AngryTeapot said, there is a need, for instance, to allow this chaos to exist. And also, especially if we are to move forward in politics and to conceive of a truly post-structural politics, let's stop, if you will, implementing all these emotional and philosophical sentiments into the various movements which exist. For instance, Hong Kong. People have put more into Hong Kong than was originally or is even conceptually capable of being there. And why is that? Because they want stability. They want a traditional form of conception, which is very familiar to them. And so in the end, as Maestro said, there's going to be not only more aestheticization of politics, so like with fascism, for instance, or with Marxism, for instance, these great conceptions and horizons of what the aesthetics were like. But moreover, we're moving into a process in a time of we won't be limited by certain mechanisms. We will use all of these mechanisms for politics, and regardless of what people conceive of or not, that seems to be the trend of now. And so, just to end my commentary or my monologue, if you will, on this, I have to say that the only time I laughed in 2019 was reading a foreign affairs article which said that autocrats were on shaky ground, and they argued it from the perspective of populism. But then immediately the subsequent article said that China is going to overtake the United States, whether the United States likes to or not, because it is not focused upon the populism or upon the aesthetics and circus of ideology.
That's a great point. Like, there is a big aspect of this that is just pure like aesthetics. But I just want to mention the fact that, like, isn't it curious how probably the most nationalistic country in the world right now, with the most powerful leader and most powerful person in power with indefinite term, Xi Jinping.
North Korea.
Well, they're actually pretty powerful, man. Like, maybe not materially, but spiritually, they're up there with the greats, especially with their biggest army per capita. But in any case, like, they're not driven necessarily by ideology, but they're driven by passion in China, and they're driven by a very strong desire to, well, take power. And that's what they're doing. And the facts are pointing to it. It's not just a fear, but they are using emotional, I wouldn't say emotional truths, but it's not just driven by this like Marxist slow accumulation of wealth or whatever. They got a plan. And the postmodern politics of Trump, of Boris Johnson, Toryism for 5 more years. They're going to have a success tour now, like Reagan and Thatcher, but just a lot more conservative.
Well,
this,
no,
like these, yeah.
No, I imagine the guy, the main the Dutch from Red Dead Redemption with Xi Jinping. Don't worry, Mr. Xi Jinping, I've got a plan.
Well, like Thatcher and Reagan were dancing in celebration. I think Boris and Trump are having their own little devilish dance, and I feel like they're taunting Xi Jinping. But please, for the love of God, Jericho, give us some kind of a escape from this horrible.
When you're asking a
formalism.
professional schizophrenic for help, you've gone downhill.
Yes. Seduce us with your.
I'm a professional schizophrenic, and I didn't need.
Shut the fuck up, weight fag. Go back to lifting. Get back to the gym. This is an intellectuals conversation. I really didn't think I would have anything to add to this conversation, but the longer I've listened to you guys talk, the more I realize that, like, this is some Metal Gear Solid shit. I don't know how else to put it. The war isn't fucking real. The trade war is more of like a threat of economic stability that's being played in like a series of proxies to keep power over something that doesn't have any reins to be controlled by in the first place. I heard actually on the radio, unironically, in my hometown of Alabama, somebody saying that like China is coming to steal our technology and our jobs. First of all, I don't even think that first part is even possible. This isn't Civ Beyond Earth where people are like they're fucking tied to the Matrix wall, sapping your data and sending it back, William Gibson style via earpiece up to solar arrays. This doesn't happen. No, I think that at this point it is entirely aesthetic, and the best way that I can put this is the aesthetic of revolution in movies. I think it's like masturbation. Coming back to the second podcast that we did, the first everything comes back to Coomers.
Good.
Hell yeah.
You go to a movie. You see Bane up on TV going, "The fire rises," and in some way, an emotional piece of you is satisfied by seeing society in disorder. I think that's why people like the Joker as well. It's masturbation for emotions of like disconnection from society. It's a virtual revolution, and if you ask me, I think that's what. At least the Twitter section or the American section of the Hong Kong protest is. It's the aestheticization of getting out frustrated emotions of being left out from the power process, which Ted Kaczynski talks about. All it is it's Ted Kaczynski's surrogacy, the issue that technology is so much bigger than people that we don't have any hand in it except aesthetically. So we just have to sit here and, jerk off our wrinkly brains to the concept of revolution, because any ounce of real fire or real fight would be snuffed out in an instant by a beast that's not conspiring against us. But I guess the way that I could put it is if a single cell in our body revolted, it would be immediately swarmed and destroyed by the status quo. And I think it works the same way in society. The police have their own aesthetic narrative of keeping the peace, but it's just the status quo. The same thing when you hear on the radio that China's trying to take your jobs. Like that's just maintaining the status quo of like isolated economies and like local economies that's been in the Republican ticket since 1900s, despite the fact it's entirely globalized now, to the point where probably half of our technology came from China or the military in the first place. So since we're probably going to be moving on to the Hong Kong protests, I assume, I just wanted to, kind of give a little bit of a segue there. Yeah, it's literally just the aesthetic that matters. It's the visualization of resistance that's not capable for the average person. And I think that's where the media bloom of hot air for such a concept arises.
It's marketable. It's easy to sell. It's like it lacks any kind of meat, so to speak. You can slap on Imagine Dragons in the background, and it would be the perfect ad.
And you notice that it's the society Dispensable all over again. It's junk food. You'll have these video clips of like dudes unironically fighting officers with, like you said, music in the background. Like there's music in the background in real life, and like they got the slow motion and the angles and like the dude like.
I understand. Yeah,
it's living. Yeah, it's vicarious. It's very vicarious and voyeuristic.
Speaking of,
but the way that war works right now.
Oh yeah, for real. In homage to voyeuristic, vicarious kind of blowing hot air from your scrotum into the air. I think we've busted our final nuts, and like what we're doing right now. In the West primarily, but also in the East, this is very cynical. Like maybe it's because my SSRIs are finally leaving this husk of a body, but like,
take your joy.
This is my final joy. I haven't busted my final nut yet, but I might do it right now, right? So I'm starting to suspect that, especially in the West, as you said, we understand perfectly that we're being domed by the establishment, hardcore. And we know that any kind of armed battle won't be successful, whether it's Area 51 or whatever. We're just going to get gunned out.
Naruto running in, save the wife.
You don't see people, talking at these kinds of historical moments. Maybe they're doing something dramatic, like standing in front of a tank or whatever. We don't hear much talking. And in homage to masturbation, I mean, like, that's basically what we're doing here, right? Some kind of an intellectual masturbation. But at least we're enjoying it, But I feel most people are not enjoying it.
Yeah. No.
Yeah,
Twitter.
yeah.
I was gonna say that we're kind of doing it ourselves in a short way, like the whole armchair Pseud leftist. Even if you're self-aware of it, I mean, the truth is, like I said, like the population's too big, the technology's too big. You can't do anything on your own without basically committing suicide, and so the only option is to like have the aesthetic of it so that you don't go crazy.
I mean, like maybe it's an aesthetic of irony or whatever, but like I think there is a genuine attempt here to actually try and understand what's going on in the world, and it's fine to be confused.
I'm not saying you're not understanding, but I'm just saying, like, let's say if Jericho, Von Criminal, decided to walk out and bomb a police station. I mean, I could choose any even if someone was like good enough to say bomb like the Pentagon or something like that, it wouldn't change anything. All it would do is like further the aesthetic, and more people would be invigorated toward the status quo. They would see it as terrorism.
Well, I mean, the thing is, right? I think what it comes down to, what we're doing, what everyone else is doing, the yellow vests or whatever, might seem like just a cope, and honestly, that might be it. But at least it's something. We haven't completely surrendered yet, so. I think it's easy to be nihilistic. It's easy to be a doomer about it. But at the same time, like, I feel we're starting to understand it. We're starting to understand just how fucked we are in terms of slacktivism, in terms of all that shit.
Also, it's very hard now to pass the microphone.
Yeah.
Break.
Yes, it's been a back and forth of, I don't want to sound rude, but it sounds a bit whiny, and I understand the premise of it, but when we recognize that we're Pseuds, we cannot be that self-aware.
That's the thing, right?
We must pretend as though our ideas are going to be listened to by Xi Jinping. And according to our sponsor, there's a very good possibility that we might be listened to by Xi Jinping. But what I wanted to say on at least what the both of you were discussing beforehand with the aestheticization of politics, I wanted to bring up, this ties in precisely to the postmodern condition. And as much as people meme this work and they use it for nefarious purposes, I think at least Jean Baudrillard's simulacra and simulation can at least provide an understanding about why a lot of these phenomena are being presented in our face, and why a lot of these films and these media, they invigorate us with a sense of, I want to go out and cause revolution, but let's be feasible here. Both the left and the right, the predominant and overwhelming majority of them, they cannot not only fire a gun, they don't know how to do anything relating to revolutionary activities. And so, at least I want to explain a general conceptualization of what Baudrillard tends to use in simulacra and simulation, where not only are we living, like I mentioned, in that post-structural politics, but we're living, as Jericho mentioned, in this complete system where it's almost unfathomable for us to understand, the intricacies of technology, of the social order, of how politics are structured, how the world economy is structured, and so on and so forth. And so we create a lot of these artificial simulacras, or these momentary fragments where these seem like these complete and self-fulfilling worlds. So, for instance, a Marxist who watches some sort of Marxist-Leninist film depicting the end of World War II, and they think, wow, we could just go do that right now if everybody was aware, where they don't conceive of how conditioned and how controlling this is, where the only thing that neoliberalism would love more is to have some sort of fake and empty ideology which could exist that has wide promulgation so it can crush it out again, and it has legitimacy for another, let's say 2 or 3 decades, where anything it does which is wrong is no longer critiqued or looked at from a very, very critical lens, because it had crushed this ideology, just as it did in the early 2000s and in 2008, for instance, where as opposed to critiquing the world market, it was, this is, the this is the remnants of the Cold War. This is us moving beyond the remnants of the Cold War, and we're moving into a properly new structure of it. So particularly what I was trying to get at in this instance is, yes, as Jericho said and has been said before, we're living in a society, obviously this was done as a particular reference to the Joker movie, which is a throwback to the first episode, but we're living within a structure where we're incapable of fathoming it in any significant manner. We don't understand how to effectively resist it. And these capsules, if you will, of aesthetic politics where, I want to become, let's say national syndicalist because it seems so cool. Reading this book seems so interesting and unique. Politics, I would say, as it is now, is inherently LARP at this point, because people who take a structural politics within a post-structural environment and they try to apply their very, very limited analysis to a wide variety of phenomena which exist. Many of these phenomena cannot even be exhausted by the monographs dedicated by experts to them, to this particular end. It fills us with a renewed confidence, which is not only false, but it is incapable of understanding a lot of the issues which face us today. And so that's why, as AngryTeapot says, we're all cynical, because the traditional projections or simulations we have, which are catered to us, are by nature incapable of exhausting us. So we return to romanticism or these other forms of taking a very, very limited and very, very empty worldview and filling it with our emotional and even psychological despair at the condition which we are in. And thus, all of us are very, very confident and very, very renewed in our ability to analyze politics. And where do most of these ideologies that are very, very romantic by nature exist? Online, which, as Jean Baudrillard said, is by nature a simulacra. It is a simulation which is more real than reality, or the hyper-reality, as he calls it.
Don't make the Twitter.
I don't know. That sounds pretty similar to, like, the media concept of the real world, the aesthetic being reality. But I just wanted to finish up my thought by saying that, especially when you were talking about people that like LARP as the vanguard online, or talk about being the vanguard, I think the aesthetic has completely supplanted reality. People really do think it's that easy. They think it's as easy as buying a wooden toothbrush. They think it's as easy as like buying a gun and training with it and waiting for the revolution. If you ask me, even as somebody that's like literally a crazy prepper that lives in the deep south, like there's a sort of understanding that comes with how deep you try to go. Like I got my ham radio license and all sorts of different things, and I just started to realize that the more I struggle, like there's an infinite well to which I can go down, and I'll never understand it all. And all it takes is one mistake. All it takes is somebody shooting you in the back of the head while you're not looking, and you're down, and you're completely fucking surrounded by the status quo. So I don't know if there's really anything that can be done. I think the aesthetic is all people have, but I kind of lost track of what I was gonna say. But everything is proxies. War, even professional soldiers are fighting by proxy now. Like, we're on the cusp of using fucking robots practically in place of real people for like the way that we do international warfare. I don't know what individuals stand a chance unless there's just a human wave of them. I think it could be possible, but the aesthetic of revolution would have to supplant reality to such degree that people were unironically convinced that it is just that easy. And what would happen is it would essentially just be a mass strike that would halt production and transport and completely befuddle the system, but it wouldn't work intentionally, in my opinion. Like, it wouldn't be a bloody battle. It would just be it would be war of attrition. People just sitting down and not doing what they're supposed to. It'd be like if your liver gave out and your body died. But Sweyn wants to talk, so now for something completely different. Someone who actually has a job.
Well, hi. Teapot, first of all, I just want to say I don't know why you wanted me on here. I'm not an intellectual.
That's
just
exactly
an African.
why I want you on here, man. Not
We
because
need less knowledge.
With the schizophrenics want a sane man. I wonder why.
Yes.
All I know is that, like, what you're talking about, it's all very first world. And at the end of the day, 90% of people don't give a fuck about revolution. They don't give a fuck about giving up. They don't give a fuck about the international order. What a lot of people want at the end of the day, and especially in third world countries like the one I live in, just want fucking bread on the table. That's all they want. And if they can get through the day, and at the end of that day, there's some bread on the table, they have rebel, right? That's how I see rebellion. And that's how I try to rebel, by feeding people, by helping the poor get through the day, because those are the people that need it the most. And I don't know, I just guess it's because of how I was raised and where I'm from, but giving up to me on all that stuff, it's a luxury. It's a luxury to say, oh, the system's fucked, let's be a nihilist, or, there's nothing you can do about it. Or that to me is a very privileged thing to say, where there are people where I live that are fighting every day just to survive. I mean, like, there are beggars everywhere I go. If you just walk down to the shops, there are at least 4 beggars at every stoplight. And I make a large part of my life just to give what I can with my limited resources. I joined protests against the government. I remember like 2-3 years ago where my entire country came together and said, fuck you, President Jacob Zuma, we're all protesting against you now. And we got him out. And like, I can't explain it to you because you're not South African, but we have a word in South Africa, it's called Ubuntu, unity, the oneness. And over the couple of years as a nation, we've been fractured, but there are small moments like that where everybody comes together, where you're a black Marxist, kick all the whites out person, or you're a liberal, or you're a conservative, whatever. You can all come together one day and say, you know what, fuck this guy. And there's a sense of community in this country sometimes where we all understand the situation we are in. And we all sometimes just have to give in to our humanity and just help the beggar outside your gate that just wants a pair of shoes, who just wants a sandwich.
Yeah, I understand completely. Yeah.
And I think that's it. Yeah, that's where I come from. That's what I do. I help people eat. I help people have a pair of shoes. And that is my rebellion. My rebellion is not becoming heartless. My rebellion is helping people.
Well, that's the thing, right? It's not at all cynical. It's quite the opposite. It's like, and it's not, how should I put it? It's not at all kind of submitting to anything. It's quite organic, if anything else. But again, like, it is very first worldist of us to have this like cynical approach and be whiny. I mean, I'm guilty of that a lot, but I think
that's all the first world has.
Not to sound like Jason Unruh here about third world theory, but I would say there is a more authentic aspect to some of these regions. People actually want to help each other out, but I don't want to abandon it quite yet. I still think we have some more intellectualization to do, and I want to do that to Vapula, right?
No, it's fine. No, I'm not trying to like. My thing is that I'm not trying to discredit you or anything. I do appreciate the work you do here, like what you say, what you do. I appreciate it. However, I'm just saying that when I look at Chile, what I see are my kinds of people.
I understand.
The people that are coming together, and sure, there's that aesthetic value, but all I see are people that want bread.
Okay, Jericho, what triggered you?
I wanted to say that just I think you had a good point, but it is just what I said. It's all the first world has. There's no real effort to like help people because people don't really need that help. They do, but even that's been aestheticized. Like you can donate.
Yeah, true. So
because people have the food on the table, they have the EBT card, they have they work at Walmart or whatever. There's a lot of stability in the first world that creates the necessity of a surrogate activity that does seem wasteful. But I think that's exactly the problem. It's the lack of any sort of agency in one's own community.
Well, that's the thing, though.
That's all I wanted to say.
Sure, maybe it's just venting or cope, but like I think there is a real need to talk about these things in a more intellectual manner, and not for the global community, but for ourselves too. So I want to introduce like Vapula. You've never been on here before. What did you want to say, man?
Sound good, right? Okay.
Yes.
The waves are good.
The vibes are good.
With regard to aestheticization of politics, I was particularly interested in kind of what both Jericho and Brig talked about, which is the cynical element. And I think it's one of the ways to look at this through, say, a more psychoanalytic lens is in the sense that there is this underlying sense of things not being able to be done. And there is this sense of like this revolutionary attitude and activity going out in the streets, shouting Stalin's name at the May Day protest, like in UK.
Begging to be shot, basically.
There does seem to be an underlying cynicism, really, but it may not appear so. It's more of the type of it's a sort of perversion, really. They don't. It's not that they don't know what they're doing, and yet they do it. They know precisely what they're doing, and yet they do it. But this is, since this outward helplessness draws inward in a sort of more narcissistic reflex, and that's where you get this sort of this aestheticization that's based around individual demeanors. Everyone's an anarcho-syndicalist or so on or something. They attach things to precisely this element of identity solely without real, genuine critique, because this activity for them is at the heart of things much more like, say, what Aristotle talks about in the Poetics, the element of catharsis and tragedy. in a tragedy, you know precisely that things are not going to go too well. Things are ultimately gonna fall apart, but you see the good and the bad, and you feel the catharsis, you feel the release as a result of the experience of that aesthetic. It's much more like a play, if anything, now. A play that's primarily based in a drawing inwards and an ultimate perversion. That's kind of how I see it with regards to the whole aestheticization. It's much more like a play in a sense. If we want to look at it through the aesthetics and the mindsets of it all.
Ah, yes, perversion. Comparing it to hentai again, we truly are the most sued.
Whoa. When did he say the word hentai?
Yeah, I didn't really quite catch that.
Perversion?
I think that's a bit of a stretch, but
It's like hentai.
What? Perversion is totally hentai. That's literally what it means. I speak Japanese here. Shut up.
it's just one of those.
I meant like the Lacanian perversion.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't read. Sorry.
Well,
Lacanian hentai. Now that would be a cool
fortunately,
Yeah, they know what they do.
Well, that's what I call praxis.
well, fortunately, I pretend to read, so I can give some kind of reply, right? I think that's a brilliant point, like the individualization of like our experience of revolution of ideology, and I think it goes really deep. Like even the Buddhist, like kind of hedonist consumerism, that's like very, how should I put it, like spiritualized almost. Like we're on a Zen trance, using Headspace apps. I mean, even I use it, right? I'm still a neurotic wreck, but the thing is, what we're doing in the West from our first worldist privileged perspective, it's not just so much whining, but there's a bigger problem. And I would say it has a lot to do with what you were saying, Vapula, and it's that we're kind of channeling all of our experiences, all this phenomena through ourselves, right? And not just our egos, but literally our experience of reality. And that's our biggest limitation. I think that's one of the best things to have someone from like South Africa, say, on, or China, or whatever. And I want to go deeper into it because it's not just a bad thing. It's also a good thing. It's what makes intersubjectivity so great, because you can synthesize different experiences into something bigger, more rich. So I want to introduce our token British student, Morvil, and I'll let you actually go. I mean, you can talk about what you want, of course, but I feel what's going on in Britain right now is very different from any other region. I mean, you guys are, what's going on with you guys?
Okay, so to explain where Britain is now, Britain has a very strange electoral system compared to the vast majority of the world, actually. Especially American audiences can be quite confused by it. So very briefly, to explain how that works, because you need that to understand how fucked Britain is currently.
Oh, yeah, true.
So, basically, we have Parliament, which is our government, but so Parliament, so there are two houses, House of Commons, House of Lords. And the House of Commons has been around since the 1200s, and the House of Lords has been around since before then. But either way, the House of Commons is
The House of Commons and
you
the
can
House
choose
of
which one is
what?
which. Either way, the House of Commons is elected, and we have the constituency system in the way America has states, but it's a lot more. We have loads and loads of constituencies, and each individual region has one. And so, like, some cities have 2 constituencies. London has about 12, the Lords. So if something goes through the House of Commons, it has to go through the House of Lords, and the Lords aren't elected, but they are often far more qualified than the House of Commons representatives. And you get a lot of people saying how awful this is and how bad this is to democracy, the existence of the House of Lords, when in reality, when you look at the House of Lords, they do generally a much better job than the House of Commons at both deciding stuff and actually being competent politicians. Either way, the good thing about all this stuff is Brexit. Actually, the reason that you obviously have seen on the news that we had Boris Johnson elected as Prime Minister, which it didn't take me by surprise, but it was the landslide victory he had, which did, because it was 386 seats, and there are 650 members in the House of Commons, and this is a vast landslide. Labour lost a bunch of seats. Liberal Democrats lost seats, which is actually quite good because you got to see the leader of the Liberal Democrats lose their seat to the SNP, which is the only good thing that came out of this election. This whole ordeal. It actually stems from Brexit, and there's been loads of things about what lost the election, etc. But Brexit, which the vote happened in 2016, so 3 years ago, and it has been vital in British politics since then. And the whole anti-EU thought, or at least the concept of being anti-EU, existed in both Labour and the Conservative Party, but it's been in Labour much longer. Because when the EU formed, it was far less of a benevolent power as it is conceived now to be by many people. It's before the Maastricht Treaty. This is longer back when it was like a coal alliance. And Tony Benn, the fantastic member of Parliament, I don't think he was Labour leader, but he was a very good member of Parliament. And he was the leader of the hard left within Labour for a very long time. He was very much a Eurosceptic, and it was his fight against the European Union which caused a lot of leftists actually to vote Leave in the election in 2016, which has done nothing but hurt the left since then, frustratingly. Either way, but the Conservative Party's Leave has been around. There's a sub-faction within the Conservative Party. The European Research Group, it's effectively a party within a party, which would be completely insignificant, except for the fact that it's got a lot of members and a lot of support, particularly Jacob Rees-Mogg, who you may have heard of, Catholic man, named his child Sextus, etc., etc. He is he's the leader of the European Research Group. But either way, David Cameron in 2016 said as a thing, if he was re-elected, he would hold a referendum on whether or not people wanted to leave or remain in the EU. This was, for most people, no one even thought about it. Most people didn't even know we were in the EU because people are fucking stupid, right? But people weren't paying attention. They weren't even aware we were in the European Union. And so David Cameron brought it up. And so because there was this pressure within the Conservative Party to be elected in that way. And so he held the election, and it was because of some very, very smart campaigning on the side of Leave. The Leave won. You had tour buses, take our NHS back. You had people like Nigel Farage, who, no matter what your opinion of him is, he's a surprisingly charismatic speaker. He's funny, and him and UKIP managed to get a lot of public traction, but ultimately that traction went towards the Conservative Party. And
please talk about Sargon.
Will, I'm getting to it. Don't worry, Jericho.
Before you go on,
he's like a charisma black hole.
I've heard people refer to Boris Johnson as some kind of how should I put it, British Trump, right?
In many ways he is. Because,
in many ways he is. In what ways?
Okay, so he started off, because Boris Johnson was, like many people who ended up becoming members of Parliament, he was a journalist originally. But he's been a politician for a very long time. The ways he's similar to Trump is that he's very, the charisma is actually, Boris Johnson has been, not only is he a newspaper baron, he can use this to get the vast majority of support for rural working class people. And it is his charm. And despite the fact that he's a complete utter buffoon, we saw he was our diplomat to the EU straight after the referendum, and we got rid of him because of how shit he was. He was dreadful. And it's like he was the one who went down a zip line in a big UK Union Jack harness with the flags. But it was Boris Johnson which had the tour buses saying "Take our NHS back," and putting these actual very this misinformation regarding how much money we sent to the EU, which could be sent to the NHS and everything. But the reason that he gets compared to Trump a lot is because of how friendly they are. In particular, what Boris Johnson's prime ministership means for the UK. Now, the UK is it's very similar to the US in many ways, but it rises above slightly in the way that it has the NHS. It has and it has a welfare system, a relatively well-established welfare system. It's in many ways it's bad. It's been struggling for a very long time, but compared to what most people have in places like the States, it is for a vast majority of people it's very good. You hear Rob Delaney, who is a former US citizen, he lives in the UK now, talking about how good it is in comparison, no matter how dreadful it can be at times. But the thing is, it's because leaving the EU means that while there are all these net benefits of leaving the EU, the issue is when we left and who's making us leave, particularly Boris Johnson. Now, Boris Johnson is very buddy-buddy with Trump, and him leaving the EU, he's using that as an excuse as for extra trade with the US. And by that extra trade, I mean many things are on the table, including the NHS. Donald Trump said the NHS was on the table, but then it was later denied by Donald Trump that he said that. And the document, so a Freedom of Information request was sent to the Conservative Party regarding trade talks between Boris Johnson and Donald Trump. And the entire document was redacted. Which tells me that the NHS is absolutely for sale. Now, while most European countries, like the fact that the UK still exists is bizarre. Like the material conditions that led to Britain existing. The fact we're mates with Scotland, the fact Scotland is a member of our country without us going in and conquering them is insane. That's rarely ever happened and has existed to this day. That's a really rare historical circumstance. But that's all being tested now because of David Cameron saying, I'll hold this election, and it being pounced upon by very charismatic and very dangerous men in the Leave campaign. And while I am personally a Eurosceptic, I supported Remain then, I support Remain now in hindsight, because hindsight is 2020, obviously. What's going to happen now is that the UK is absolutely leaving the EU. We've had 3 years of nothing happening, but we've now seen passports are now being printed out the EU, and it's going to be happening by the 21st of January. Is the beginning of the end, really, and that's when we're going to start to leave.
Oh boy.
And then, when we leave, instantly the US is on it. And most European countries, actually all of Europe, especially within the EU, are safe, actually. No matter how exploitative the EU can be, they are safe trade-wise from Russia, America, and in many ways China. It's a big issue. It's a fear a lot of European countries have, is their trade being dominated by China. And the EU provides protection from that. Even if you're a country that's not in the EU but is very close to the EU, Iceland and Norway, you still have that relative trade protection from the EU. And the UK suddenly doesn't have that. And by having this massive Conservative majority with very dangerous people in it, Boris Johnson, I can imagine we'll have a reinstituted national service. I imagine we could have a lack of our NHS, because we've had Jeremy Hunt, sorry, my mistake. Him, Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson all proposing a change into an insurance-based medical system. We have, and it's, I know you're going to speak quickly afterwards. I'm just trying to get through this as quickly as possible now.
No, don't go on.
And it's what we can is these many old things in Britain are going to be reinstituted, and this rarely ever happens in countries where you have something that has been widely viewed on by the public as bad being reinstituted 50 years after the fact. National service was our mandatory conscription post World War II. So after World War II, every man between 18 and 21 was required to serve, and they rarely saw combat. They were mostly deployed to places like Mandate Palestine. Eventually, some did get deployed to Korea, which obviously was an actual fucking war zone. So, not all cozy. But having national service being reinstituted is absolutely something that could happen because of the fact there's people who support this very high up in the Conservative Party. And then there's Labour. People keep asking why Labour lost, and people keep diverting the blame from Jeremy Corbyn, and it's not Jeremy Corbyn's fault, but he is a big reason why the party lost. But mostly because since day one of him being leader, it has been a consistent character assassination of him by The Sun, the Daily Express, by the BBC itself. They ran a whole segment on how he was a Russian spy. because of him saying that when we had that former KGB agent being poisoned, what he said is we shouldn't rush to conclusions. Obviously, not a very smart political view when everyone knows it was Russia, but him saying let's not rush into it. And then the BBC had a big banner of him with the Lenin cap on, like the church in Moscow behind him with a big hammer and sickle. And the BBC had broke their contract during this election, defamed Jeremy Corbyn. We had a reporter saying, and if Boris gets this majority so rightfully deserves, and even if you don't trust the Sun and the Daily Express or I don't know, or the Daily Mail, you were probably going to trust the BBC if you're a British person because it's the British Broadcasting Company.
Wait, yeah, I was going to say, isn't the BBC publicly funded? Are they allowed to do shit like that?
They're not, but they did. They broke their contract, and that's extremely illegal. That is without a doubt illegal. But of course, the BBC, no one's going to challenge that. Funnily enough, the most impartial view of this election came from one of the private companies, ITV, Independent TV, which is the main opponent of the BBC, and it is our independently funded news service. And as a rule, it's generally better than the BBC. By some strange coincidence, this privately owned corporation serves the people better than this public one. But So Jeremy Corbyn is definitely, many people vastly dislike Jeremy Corbyn. Not because of anything Jeremy Corbyn has done, but because what people have said Jeremy Corbyn has done. The Sun released this big sort of character assassination, like the truth about Corbyn. And all that really came out is he holidays in Cuba, he speaks Spanish, and he makes his own jam. And people still freaked out, like, he goes to Cuba, he must be a communist. And all that sort of garbage that has been repeated for about Labour leaders since Clement Attlee. So that is a big reason. And Brexit as well. Labour, I say we because I'm a member of the Labour Party, Labour had a neutral stance on Brexit, which is a very smart position because it was like we want to draw both Leave and Remain voters. But what would have been, because Remain was the vast majority of the Labour Party, but there was a significant Lexit faction, it probably would have served them better to back one side or another. Even if they were going to say we're going to respect the results of this election, it still may have had Remainers vote for them. But if they said we're going to back a second referendum, then it would have got them more votes, and it would have stopped people voting for the Liberal Democrats. And it was voting for the Liberal Democrats instead of the Labour Party, which lost loads of seats. It was people going to the polling stations in Labour seats and voting Liberal Democrats, which allowed the Conservatives to gain slim majorities and gain lots and lots of seats. And so 386 seats are to the Conservative Party, unquestioned majority. So nearly everything that goes through will be, they'll be able to do it with very little opposition, because it's not like in the Roman Senate, you can't veto. It all depends on the House of Lords. Luckily, the House of Lords has got many Labour lords in it, but the way the House of Lords is structured is it has 21 bishops and lords of all four parties, with one Green Lord and relatively equal amounts of Lib Dem, Labour, and Conservative lords. And lords, they aren't like the landed nobility. You can get lorded. A bunch of the people who are now lords used to be members of Parliament in the Commons and got given it. So again, like I said earlier, the hatred for the House of Lords is, well, in many ways, on a principle, I did it. It is an offence to our democracy that there is an unelected upper house which can veto what happens in the lower one. In practice, it does work quite well. Anyway, what was your question? I don't really have much else to add at the moment.
That's a lot of information to digest, but I can kind of get the gist of it. And the thing is,
where was the Sargon of Akkad part?
Oh, right, yeah. UKIP died because Sargon ran for.
He got hit with a fish, and that was funny. Yeah, no, but it was okay. The reason I asked is because you said Nigel Farage is really charismatic, and the first thing that came to mind was Sargon having the fish thrown into him. Wow, they really balanced out, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. Because UKIP UKIP was not a racist party originally, but it's like those sort of far-right parties that they do attract racists, because of course they do. And it was mostly former members of the BNP being made of former members of the National Front, joining UKIP, and UKIP Nigel Farage left UKIP because he thought it was too racist, if that gives you any indication of how far they'd sunk. And he formed the Brexit Party, which is entirely about Brexit. And then you have, and the UKIP, they ran Count Dunkula, he ran, Sargon ran. Now, hypothetically, Sargon has a lot of followers, but none of them are in one place. None of them are in one constituency to vote for him. But he wasn't running in member of parliament. He was running for member of European Parliament. Now that gives him more chance to succeed as a UKIP candidate because the European Parliament, especially for the UK, was dominated by UKIP and the Liberal Democrats. Because the only people who vote in the European elections are people who give a shit about Europe, which tends to be people who are super pro-Europe or people who are super anti-Europe. And of course, all the Brexit Party seats all the UKIP seats got taken by the Brexit Party, and many Labour seats got taken by the Liberal Democrats. Of course, that's just how it goes. And Jericho is right. Sargon is a black hole in charisma. He nearly single-handedly spelled the death of the party when it was revealed that he said he wouldn't rape Jess Phillips. And his reaction to this was saying, actually, under enough pressure, I might rape this member of parliament, respected politician. That's maybe on the internet you can get by with that, but in actual civilized society, no matter how uncivilized the UK.
Well, that's what it is, right? It's like the separation between the online, which even fucking Jim Medicare warned him. He's like, dude, they're gonna eat you alive for the things that you've done online. Like the aesthetics are completely different. You're moving into boomer territory, and he just didn't buy it.
I watched the video of the Sargon rally in Reading. It was it was Woking, and it was all like the people who would all the people there are people who you would expect to arrive at a Sargon rally. Like it was a mix between super skinny people and some very, very large neckbeards. And that was interesting. I actually saw 3 fedoras in the whole audience. Anyway, So if anyone wants to speak afterwards,
the more I listen to you, the more I realize there's so many ways to go about this. But because I originally want to just ask you a question regarding the power of charisma in British politics, but I kind of want to give like a preamble to it first, like as to why I'm asking the question to begin with. And I'd rather say that like in the spirit of Huntington, and like we were going to go into China later, but I feel Britain, especially now after the consolidation of power with the Tories, that it's more of a civilization state than just a nation state with one people. There seems to be values that somehow hold everything together. And I'm not sure what the center of it is. My suspicion is that people are deeply emotionally attached. And it's not just emotionally, of course, but people desire and they really value the idea of democracy, right? And Brexit, maybe if they thought about it a little bit more, they could see that, yeah, it's probably not very good for economics. It's probably not good for international politics, right? But we voted on this, and it's only fair that we give it a shot, right? And so I could say that a lot of the things that happen in Britain has to do with aesthetics of politics and especially the charisma of politicians, because that would explain, right? That would explain why they did try to do character assassinations, and why you had examples of people saying, I don't support Brexit. I don't support Boris Johnson, but I could never vote for Jeremy Corbyn. And I don't understand why. Like, he's not an anti-Semite. He's not. All these things are, I wouldn't call it fake news, but they're definitely misrepresentations of him, right? And so what I'm kind of getting the vibe of is that people just don't genuinely like Jeremy Corbyn. And the thing is, even though people like Sargon of Akkad, like he has a lot of followers and he has a very long history of talking to people all across the political spectrum, but he's gone kind of a stale character. And I think his narcissism, his e-persona, that isn't real charisma. That is kind of e-clout. And he tried to put it into politics and just made an embarrassment of himself, right? So I don't think the fact that Sargon didn't succeed points to like the lack of power of aesthetics, of charisma in politics, but on the contrary, that people don't like Sargon of Akkad.
No, it's different flavors, man.
Yeah.
Like so Sargon is like he's like an aggressive style, whereas British politics specifically, maybe Morvil can chime on this, but it strikes me as civility politics.
It absolutely is.
Yeah, so like when you take a fucking, like, what do you call, like a dipshit blood sporter, and you put them into civility politics, like the types don't match. It's suicide.
So, what Teapot
Two
said
tub
about it
tubs.
being a civilization state, and what Jericho said, it's very much about how civilized you are. It's about how polite you are. I know there's a stereotype of English people being polite, but I know anyone in the server who's spoken to me can say, as a rule, I'm not that rude. It's actually a British thing. And honestly, being polite, it's not valued in being politeness, but it is civility. Because it's important to understand that British people pride themselves on their democracy, ironically. It's because nearly every system of government, the democracies in the West now especially, come directly from British influence. Especially America is a good example. Well, people point to Athens and Greece, and their democracy is the start of European democracy. But in many ways, it was following the Magna Carta signing. This is the first time in Europe since then that the barons have risen up and said, we want to say. And it was 1215 that the Magna Carta was signed, which the Magna Carta is cited as being the beginning of democracy in the medieval period. And it was the start of what we have now. And it's seen as the original Bill of Rights, or at least that original document. And what Jericho said about putting people in that sort of environment. We do have a Prime Minister's question time. We do have politicians insulting each other viciously. Funnily enough, the only person who didn't do that was Jeremy Corbyn. He was the only person who didn't launch personal attacks, which got him a surprising amount of respect. In fact, when they were campaigning, they did very, very well in their campaigning. It was only until later on that they failed, mostly because of certain stances on Brexit. But it was Sargon was unpopular because you look at him, and the look of a politician is actually quite important, but it's the way they speak and what they've said. Jeremy Corbyn in Parliament a lot of the time sounds really bored because he cares, obviously. He's a very good constituency MP. He cares about his constituency, which is Islington, which is in London. He cares about his people, but he also... but a lot of the time, when he doesn't care, you can hear it. But when it was on the when it was debating following Theresa May's resignation, when he was debating the deal, which had been organised by Boris Johnson originally, he got loads of support because of how vocal he was and how emotional he was. And being like that in English politics helps. Being charismatic helps. Because a lot of the time, people don't think. They think what they're told to think. And ultimately, it depends on who's best at telling you what to think. And this is the same the world round, but it's especially pronounced in Britain, I've seen. Because if someone who sounds smart, who's charismatic, can tell you this, and if you aren't particularly interested yourself, you can definitely agree with that. Boris Johnson, he was bigged up by the newspapers he owns, like The Sun, Daily Mail, Daily Express, who all support him, bigging him up as this great symbol of like democracy and of British values. Because of course British values are very important. We have to be taught them in school now, which is a new piece of legislation. I think it was brought in by him personally. You have to be taught British values, and which has only just started lessons where I am as well. So it's that same sort of thing. And so, of course, he doesn't own all the big newspapers, but the people who do support him, and because he's mates with them, he pays them, and because they bigged him up as this. It got the elderly vote by far, because the elderly are the only people who still read newspapers, and is the elderly and the working class still read newspapers, physical newspapers, the physical print that you can get at the corner shop, the tabloids. They're the people who still read it. Although we've got a growing class of people who look on the internet for their opinions, which is almost as bad. Like, you are getting a much wider array of opinions, but a lot of the time you're getting much worse opinions. Like, The Sun may say support Boris Johnson to keep the lights on. Like, Jew Killer 9000 on Twitter says we need to murder all Muslims. You're getting a wider array of opinions, but you're getting much worse opinions at the exact same time.
I understand what you mean. Like, obviously, I want to make sure that like every time we even border upon, let's put it this way, vulgar expressions like that. It's within context, sure, it's fine, but it's kind of absurd that we've kind of accepted this level of, I wouldn't even call it discourse, but way of communicating with each other. Whether it's rape jokes or I think it's sad. Like it's not,
quite depressing.
I'm not disgusted by it, but yeah, I don't think everyone is this cynical.
But it's like when people say the N-word, some people get terrified. I
and I mean,
cool, that guy said the N-word, I don't care.
Like again, sure, we have this problem of cancel culture or what people want to say, but it's quite hard to be self-policing all the time. And you can only do your best, of course, but I feel like everyone is kind of went beyond the power that words have. And I feel like people are just using it to kind of trigger people because they're so bored. They don't even care about freedom of expression anymore. It's just like pure reaction. But that isn't really what I wanted to say. What I wanted to say is that looking at British politics, like the way you describe it, you could almost get the view that people are domesticated animals, right? They kind of follow the program and they don't rise up. I mean, there was this instance of the protests in the early 2010s, but that's about it.
Those riots weren't political, though. In many ways, they were just people who've completely just fucking fed up. It started off with the shooting of a innocent black guy, Lee Rigby, and because the police officer thought he had a firearm in Britain, where firearms are uncommon and illegal. Because, yeah, of course, he's black, he must have a firearm. That's the attitude. And they shot Lee Rigby and he died. And it was later found out that he was completely innocent. He did not have a firearm. He did nothing wrong, and he was killed by a police officer. And suddenly, the British public, or at least especially in London, it started off being political protests. Like, we need to stop. Because as a rule, the British police force do very well in their anti-racist sort of thing, because they were institutionally racist up until around 1985, when the Scarman report revealed following the Brixton riots that there was institutional racism within it, and the independent police complaints authority was set up. And as a rule, the British coppers are generally all right. There's a very little amount of racism in there, and that is, but you do get the odd one, like the guy who shot Lee Rigby. And since it had been increasing in London at that time, this sudden racism, then you had these rioters, and eventually these riots started. But then most of the time, people thought, "Okay, this is a great way to go rob my local Tesco Express," which is what a lot of people did. They were throwing bricks through windows, and people were like, "Oh yeah, look how base this is." Well, no, it was just causing like property damage to working class people in like southeast London, in Peckham. You would like where nobody there is making more than 40,000 a year. They are breaking their windows and shit, things that are expensive, and it's that is that's the closest we've had to revolutionary momentum.
I understand.
In Britain.
But again, it feels like pure reaction, like just destroying stuff.
Just destroying stuff for the sake of it. It's like anarchists who light bins on fire and say, "I'm starting a revolution."
And again, like it just feels like coping, but
lube your trash can, boys. The black block's coming in.
Exactly.
Yeah, but like the problem with the beating the trash can is like I feel like it's a misrepresentation of the actual cynicism people have. It's not so much that they're raging and angry and want to like. It's almost like they want to prove a point, And what I mean that it's kind of sad that people have taken to this like vulgar form of expression on social media and in real life too, is that it's almost that they're self-aware that a lot of politicians view the population as domesticated animals, but using this kind of vulgar language and pseudo-racism, it's almost like hinting at, if it weren't for the social contract, if it weren't for liberalism, if it weren't for the current state of democracy, we'd just be savages and kill each other. So, you know what? Take your political correctness aside. I want my ability to speak freely, or I'm literally going to destroy everything you love, right? And that's what I wouldn't say terrifies me, but if I were to transition into the real meat of the topic that we've somehow been avoiding for a very long time. before
because
that,
we have somebody watching and listening us constantly.
That's the
remember.
thing, though, right?
The department is watching.
I mean, it could be a pity joke, but at the same time, it's like I wouldn't call it like an epiphany I had, but this idea that Lacan had about, there is no big other, and then you have Zizek who says, well, the big other, it's there, but it's closer than you would expect, right? And we should be more aware of it. But I think, like, maybe it's just a perversion of first world individualism. But I really feel like this big other, we are that big other, like, as individuals. It's not that we're trying to, like, how should I put it? Seek validation or kind of just how should I put it? Try out the waters, see what works, see what causes a mental breakdown and like a political crisis. I feel like when people do these kinds of little reactions, or rather vulgar, like when they joke about rape or whatever, it's almost like they're trying to prove to themselves that they are able to restrain themselves. And
even I would rape her.
I mean, like, it's really fucked up. But if you take that away, right? If you assume that people are aware of the capability they have as human beings, as some kind of an animal, and they fully act upon that, you don't have to go to history to see that. You can just go to Hong Kong right now, and see how they've given up on notions of democracy, like in practice, notions of like civil discourse. They're just straight up destroying the entire town. I think they're quite aware about the negative consequences of their behavior, but they're putting everything on the table. It's like you said in the previous podcast, Brigadeiro, if I'm not wrong, that it's a kind of total war mentality, like, and this time the people that are really threatening, which it's not those in power, it's almost cynical citizens that it's no longer, I just want to grill, for God's sake. It's I just want to be able to feel like I live in a society, and if you can't even use your phone, like, if whatever you do, you can't just put down your phone, right? You can't just go outside and enjoy the sunny weather. You can't just be yourself. You literally can't just live in a society. It doesn't work like that. You have to, especially in a country like China, you actually have to obey those in power. And some people would rather die than do that. So I don't know, like, who wants to go first? We're really just gonna both shit on Hong Kong, but like, it's not something that I particularly enjoy anymore, at least. So
on that note, we are segueing to our resident Hong Kong and gym expert, Brigadeiro.
Yes, hello. Jim Bro has returned from his shower.
Did you need to cool down there, buddy?
Shit is on now.
A little bit. And we're going to cool down by beating up Hong Kong, which is a very good therapeutic way for me to relax.
Yes.
So I was listening to what Angry was saying about that, especially the cynicism concerning Hong Kong. And Holter actually wanted me to bring this up in the podcast. I'm going to do so as a side note, but Angry, I think it would be beneficial for you to look at the sort of mass movements that we're seeing, or even the cynicism associated with that, from that total war mentality you mentioned, where Holter wanted me to say that really the anarchists nowadays, they don't have to have an end goal and conception anymore. Sometimes they just do it for the love of violence.
Yeah.
That's a very important thing, especially concerning Hong Kong, because at this point, any sort of semblance to being reasonable or being fair or being impartial to the system, those have been long flown out of the window now that pretty much robbery is common at this point within Hong Kong, and stores are vandalized regardless of their sentiments on a pro-China or pro-Hong Kong basis. So really what I wanted to say, especially since this is a good segue into something I wrote initially, at least concerning the total war mentality, is people like to project mass movements or large protests, for instance, with these sort of Clausewitzian tendencies, as you would call it. And Clausewitz was, as I'm sure many of you already know, he wrote effectively what became the post-Napoleonic era manual on how war ought to be conducted and how politics ought to be conducted in conjunction with that. And a large characteristic of the Clausewitzian mentality, especially with how these sort of protests are taken out, is they have to be totalizing, quick, and explosive tendencies outwards, which is why, by nature, these sort of protests like the Yellow Vests or the Hong Kong protest or the Chile protest usually won't produce anything beyond maybe a change of presidents or perhaps a change of certain policies in place, because there's no sort of direction and sense to which this violence is directed, especially with places like Hong Kong now, where really the police aren't going to stop you unless you're right in front of them. If you just go somewhere within Hong Kong, most of the police are dealing with the riots right now. So you could genuinely break into a gold store, take thousands or tens of thousands worth of dollar of jewelry, and slip away like a bandit in the night, and nobody will know you were there. And so that's primarily why these sort of protests are always ineffective and they never do anything, is because the leaders who arise are not qualified whatsoever. There's no sort of political theory or beliefs or even codified understandings of it beyond something very, very abstract, like we either want this to be done away with, which is generally where the protests are taken or left at that matter, or if these protests go on long enough, we want democracy, we want freedom, we want something else. Well, what initially happens? If these sort of protests aren't just completely squashed and destroyed under the boots of the overseeing party or those who they have to obey, and they're taken seriously and given some credibility for debate, what generally happens? Well, they invite any of the leaders, quote unquote, of the protests to a sort of debate, if you will, or conversation. And predominantly what becomes more and more evident is that they have no clue what they want. They have no clue what they're doing whatsoever. They just have these abstract and fanciful notions within the clouds, which they cannot articulate or do in any way. And so that's why I don't feasibly see Hong Kong going anywhere. And especially if, not even taking the civilizational state or the nuances of Oriental, I don't like to call it Oriental because that's a very dirty, at least Chinese culture as a whole, and so on and so forth. Not taking it at those, even just taking it from a purely political within Hong Kong. It won't be terribly conducive to Hong Kong if it were to become a democracy. Not only would the English have to revise the Anglo-Sino agreements for the leasing of Hong Kong back to China, which is recognized by the UN, so you'd have to somehow go through all of the hoops and nuances of trying to do it from there. But if Hong Kong did become independent, well, what's going to happen to Hong Kong? Well, for one, because of the status they're afforded by China, they're going to have to implement tax laws. And they can't be terribly low tax laws because they don't have China able to make up most of their debts or even take on most of their debt in order for Hong Kong to continue succeeding. So there's a few consequences that result from this. One being Hong Kong's civil administrators are educated within China. I wouldn't say they're necessarily all appointed by China because a lot of them are elected, but most of them are trained within China and learn how to be bureaucrats within the Chinese model, or at least how the two systems, one country policy is conducted. So all of the civil servants that exist in Hong Kong now will just completely vanish. They'll go away overnight. So what happens? Well, you might get something like you saw with the Iranian Revolution, where all of the civil servants that existed went away, and there's this furious and fervent debate about who will become the successor to the party or to the Shah in the case of Iran. And more often than not, it's seeming as though the faction that wants to be directly under British occupation again would most likely win, which isn't terribly conducive to democracy as they wanted, because that would necessitate a form of imperialism or oversight, which would be contrary to the sort of democracy they're advocating. They'd effectively be an illiberal democracy, which is already what they are. Moreover, in comparison to other
Asian countries. ASEAN stands for ASEAN, which is generally the Asians, the Southeast Asian Trade Agreement, or the trade association that exists there. They would completely lose their relevance whatsoever. They'd become virtually like Taiwan, and Taiwan is one of the most irrelevant economies there, because Hong Kong tries to implement the Singapore model. And if you know about Singapore, Hong Kong does not have natural oil or any sort of natural resources by which they can maintain low tax laws. In fact, the only reason Hong Kong exists is to be an export for China. It is an export-focused economy because it is a tiger economy. So let me paint the picture for you of what independent Hong Kong would look like. Most of these businesses would just flat out leave within the first year of Hong Kong becoming a democracy because A, they don't have the guaranteed stability which China gives to Hong Kong, because Hong Kong obviously won't be invaded because China will fight back against them. 2, Hong Kong will not have the same sort of stability because it will not have the same tax laws, legal laws, or even, as they call it, economic freedom by which trade and business can be conducted. And thirdly, Hong Kong, in all which gets in power as a bureaucrat, it will completely degenerate. It will not be the sort of model it is nowadays. It will completely have a de-evolution, if you will. It might, in fact, become like Indonesia is, where, the capital of Indonesia is very well modernized, but already the pretty inequality that exists in terms of wealth for Hong Kong, that will be exasperated by tenfold by any sort of pretense to keep it afloat. So, at least from a political standpoint, and we'll obviously go into the other factors which exist within the Hong Kong protest, from a political standpoint, Hong Kong becoming an independent democracy, especially in the region of the world where it is, that is political, economic, social, and cultural suicide for Hong Kong.
Yeah. What you want to do a lot of the times is kind of give context to it and say, like, like even Zizek, it's like this guy everyone goes to when they want to have like a psychoanalytical perspective of why things happen and like, what will you do? What are you going to vote for in the United States? But, he said, I support you. You can count on me. I'll support Chile. I'll support Bolivia and all these other nations that are going through really harsh economic conditions right now. And he even supported Hong Kong in the beginning, right? But does it even matter? Like, I don't think it matters anymore because the end result really was going to be the same. And that's the thing. It's like, we're not being crazy here. We're not like, writing the end of history or whatever. Like, that wasn't a joke. Like, I'm saying, like, what we're doing here is just, it all adds up. Like, these are not ramifications. Like, if you look at history, if you look at just what's going on right now, we're not talking about what's going to happen. We're talking about what already is happening. Look at the stock markets. Look at the cities. Look at what normal people are saying. They can't even go to their jobs anymore. Effectively speaking, capitalism as it has functioned in the past is slowing down. And there's a bunch of cogs that have just completely stopped. And like it's not looking good for them. And you can't say that it's any kind of positive thing at all. But then again, can you blame them? And I don't think you can blame them. But like, to give your support from another country, if you're a libertarian in the United States, if you're a liberal in the UK, and you're looking for human rights movements, this has nothing to do with that, in my opinion, at least. I think it's a lot more about, kind of the Joker. You get what you fucking deserve, and what you deserve is for us to tear down this economy, tear down everything around us, because we don't care about the social contract anymore. We don't care about our lives anymore. We don't have anything we value here anymore. But is that a justification for it? Absolutely not. Like, I think we can do better than this. Like, that's the point. I don't want to whine all the time. Like, it can be rough in these days, right? But like, when you're looking at a situation like that, the reason you criticize it is not because you're, well, maybe on this podcast we are a little bit too lenient on China as like an alternative to Western capitalism. But the thing is, we could do a lot better than that. And perhaps better would be do nothing at all. But hey, like, we're not trying to provide necessarily an alternative. But
we just want to feed the process.
Yeah,
the process will be feeded by us.
Maestro, please, can you like insert your deep unconscious desires? Like, what do you see in front of you in Hong Kong? Like, what goes through your head?
I mean, it's, again, extremely complex processes which we witness, which are interacting with each other. At the same time, there is this risk to lose ourselves when analyzing this process, losing ourselves into these ivory towers and looking in general at the protesters, for example.
Yes, like exactly.
Brig mentioned correctly that there is looting, for example, the ordinary people, the working people, because let's be honest, the Hong Kong protesters are mostly kids, kids that go on weekend protests just because that's the thing. It's just because, like, right now, into this kind of world which we exist, in which we have this kind of interactions, which don't have we don't have alternative structures. The structures which rise up today, we talked with Brig time ago in regards to that, are structures that interact with each other inside another superstructure. So they all follow the same rules. In this case, the rules are those of the world trade. No matter if you have like the Chinese capitalism, you have the American capitalism, you have the European capitalism, you have even the socialism, but all of those act in the optic of world trade in regards to that, in which we are all economic subjects. And of course, the struggle, the encounters will be meaningless in regards to the political and the cultural, because everything becomes this kind of sheet paper, basically this Excel dick measuring contest in which we take out our Excel sheets and show how productive is our economy and such. There are no spaces for political expression because those spaces are completely sterilized, because they have no impact in us being like economic actors in the end, because that's what we are here in the end, playing this game in which we are like completely just layered down. And Sweyn presented a good idea in regards to South Africa and what he does, for example. Just kind of, there isn't just kind of political struggle in which is a genuine political struggle, and it's not about like, sticking it up to the establishment or such, but actually building structures. Frederick Jameson talked about like the idea of the universal army, for example, these kind of alternative systems that actually interact outside the big structure. Like, we need to think outside the box, but we need to think outside the box of the trade and capital even. Like, we need to think outside the box and build communities by itself, as hippie as fucking as it sounds. But that's what it thinks, makes connection, bring communities. That will allow us to make not only just inner peace and that, but it's actually much more useful than people think about it, because it allows people to see different experiences, to interact with each other, to progress, to build. That can be enhanced to a world level too. Again, we talked with Brig about that. Different systems that interact with each other outside the superstructure, there can be even radically different, or there can be like a world of multiple socialisms, but they do not act under like a matrix of a greater socialism, so to speak, but they interact with each other, they confront each other, they understand each other via different means. They can use multiple means of understanding each other. Embrace schizophrenia, embrace complete absence of a centrality. You don't need to search for this kind of central aspect, to your lives. Just communicate, unite, make machinic assemblies, like Deleuze would say. Connect, create machinic connections and build up, and everything will create. That's the thing. It's not go for an ideal. Don't go for an ideal. Create, communicate. make connections, and that will help. That will actually make a change, because that will allow you to build alternatives, actual alternatives.
Damn straight, right? So I'm not going to use any oil here. I'm just going to pull the lever, go with the train. No lube. It's just brute force into number 2, right? So here, I think I might just full on just embrace the schizophrenia of it all. Your talk about community, and I feel that is like vital aspect, like in our Western and hyper individualized world, with a lack of human agency, where the individual loses, the community wins, right? And so how do you actually build a community in the 21st century? Through social media. Is it just memes? Obviously not. They die after a while and they get recycled. It's a false universality, just like anyone else that has attempted to build a new one, with the xenofeminists, with all due respect, with their semiotic parasites. I mean, what are we doing here, right? Like, let's go back to the basics. I'm not giving a normative claim here. I'm just saying, take a deep breath and look at the actual struggles, the actual antagonisms that's going on right now in the social sphere, right? So one thing that really struck out to me lately was, it's both of a little factoid and what is technically a meme, but it's far more than that. And it is the, okay boomer, right? So what does that actually mean? I'm not saying like what is the pretext behind the meme or whatever. What does it mean that people are using this in a political context, and it has vast implications? First of all, the little factoid, which is apparently, I didn't know this until like a month ago, or even less than that. Our generation, the Zoomers or whatever, I'm just saying this out of so people know what I'm talking about. But like the last 20 years, the people of this generation are one of the first to actually experience living standards lower than the previous one. And it has nothing to do with technology or like whatever. It's that we have new expectations, new stresses, new social issues with social media. We've been experimented on, like with the new dating problems, how we communicate with each other. Not only is it harder to find a partner and actually connect or find a sense of purpose or whatever, it's actually difficult to build a community centered around, I would say, something productive. And that's not just within the confines of like consumerism. So when you're trying to build a genuine political movement, it's easy to actually become what you've been protesting against, which is being a domesticated animal, this pure internationalism of trying to, we're going to support Rojava. That's good. We want to support the international protest. That's good. But supporting Hong Kong, supporting, like, I don't know, fucking Evo Morales stepping down, like all these contingencies that you claim as like historic events, they're not, right? We can do a lot better than that. And the central point here is that the okay boomer signifies, in my opinion, a new class divide, the boomers and the zoomers. And what does that mean? Well, it means that we're actually kind of, well, maybe selfishly, but we understand that we could be way better off than this. And that maybe we're taking a lot of things for granted, like, I don't know, not human rights or whatever, not in a good way, in a bad way, that we're too humble. We're too tied up in not only what we say in self-censorship, but the very confines of what we can and cannot do. So I think the very fact that people are cynical in Hong Kong has nothing to do with what they actually could achieve if they truly found alternatives to the pure reactionism that's going on. I think there is still, I wouldn't say hope, but still room to actually challenge the current order and power. But if we don't do that, if we just follow the orders of the boomers currently in power, and if we kind of embrace the cynicism of social media or whatever, whatever is on the latest trends of Twitter, if that's all that's going through our heads, then, we might as well just submit to the state capitalist, like neo-nationalist wave of politics that is currently sweeping all over Europe, all over Asia, and perhaps even America. And I don't know how to do that, but like, I think not giving up and not just taking it to the streets, like actually thinking about the ramifications of your actions and, well, confronting the shit we're in without being a little pussy about it, you know?
Form connections, go around, make friends, go on.
Yes, exactly. I mean, we can really learn from the South Africans.
You always on your damn phone.
Well, maybe it's not the phone, you know, it's us. We can blame the South African.
You can always learn from the South African, okay? And
in this context,
it all boils down to community starts with you, in my opinion, right? It just starts with you. You can't say we need community. You gotta start by maybe talking to your neighbor, making friends with people you live close to, and encouraging them to make friends with their neighbor. That's how it starts. That's how you build it. When it all boils down to it, we have more in common than we don't have in common. It's really simple. And people with common interests will work to a common goal. It's really very simple. And that's how you rebel. You rebel with community. You don't rebel with guns. You don't rebel with mass demonstrations and protests and rioting. That's the aesthetic of rebellion. Actual rebellion is by showing humanity, and in the face of what seems all doomy, is by just being a human and working with humans.
Well, Sweyn, I don't want to say that we're like humans in the regard that the West world has constructed it, but definitely like we need to take some kind of responsibility in it, right? Otherwise we're fucked.
Yeah. Well, South Africa also taught me that you could stop thefts by installing a flame gout on the side of your car, which fits in well with our sponsor.
Ridgewater.
True.
Chinese one.
No, the car dealership.
Yeah, the big bill.
I know, also big hell bill cars.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
I think another insight with the help of our sponsor, and he's a patron of Brig. Brig can also offer another insight thanks to the big bill health car.
Yeah.
Very good help.
As much as I like this conversation, it's still unsatisfactory to me.
Damn straight it is.
I understand this from individual perspective, but like all of you have mentioned before, you have to embrace the schizophrenia, and you have to create metastructures to some degree. Yes, creating a sense of community is good, at least to alleviate the suffering of people, but that's still, in my opinion, a very, very, very limited policy mechanism by which you can implement real change, because at a certain point, especially as the long ideological beliefs that AngryTeapot gave out, that seems to be what people are actually most tending towards nowadays, less so towards human authenticity. And as strange as this might sound, people, as we've discussed before, people who sound smart are generally taken very seriously. Their opinion is held very highly. And in fact, I would argue that more and more, either it's oligarchical or technocrat or bureaucrat, whatever sort of social composition we have nowadays, it's tending less and less to people trying to think about these great structures, because as we've all virtually agreed upon, capitalism and state structure now is virtually schizophrenic and incomprehensible. People cannot understand it in a way which is very significant and very meaningful, which is, as we've all noted before, a return of very limited, very outdated, anachronistic politics, if you will, especially within the spider sphere. So that actually seems to be, ironically, the tendency which the West will probably go towards, is people being alienated, even in an attempt to make a community. The community has the issue of scalability. And I don't see feasibly the nature of how the West functions, a scalable system of how community can function, which really can transcend the regional ability of that. And that's why, really, as you see with China, China doesn't just try to make a community. China does what it needs to do with the technocrats it has in place, and it makes sure to alleviate and help these communities. But by and large, they don't need to justify themselves to the people, because why is that? Well, China is a highly developed, highly modernized economy. China has arguably the largest potential for economic growth. It has the largest population in the world. It has an immense landmass, a variety of cultures. 30 plus cultures exist within China nowadays. To try to explain that to the average person or to a small community is unfathomable nowadays. And so I would say, to a certain degree, yes, having this sense of community is necessary, but really at this point, what the West or what people listening need to do is, as I mentioned before, they need to become an anarch to some degree. They can't be caught up in trying to comprehend structures, because no insult intended towards anybody. Virtually nobody here is capable of understanding the nuances and complexity by which the structure functions, and to try to do so is folly, to say the least. That is why technocrats and hyper interdisciplinary focus is being very, very much discouraged. People are becoming very specialized nowadays because it is at a point of complexity, advancedness, and efficiency, where in large, trying to have politicians be economists and politicians and also be agriculturalists is counterintuitive to it. And so I know this may be a very, very gloomy and depressing thought to have, but really the spirit of what this podcast tries to capture is we're not just intellectually jerking ourselves off or trying to make ourselves more competent, but it's to bring a variety of views which likely won't be taken or given account of, because people would rather, feed the very, very convenient and very, very good sounding pills which exist, but in actuality do nothing to compare them. So really, to end the podcast on the spirit of, as Jericho said, no matter how many times or how much you become prepared, you'll always be insufficiently so. And so the best thing you can do is, even though you may be insufficient in your ability to resist capitalism or the coming wave of technology and so forth, the best thing you can at the very least do is to not let yourself be caught up within the whirlwinds of it, and to at least formulate some sort of escape plan, even if it's fragmentary and completely fantastical at the least, just to have that small essence of hope there. And even then, that hope shouldn't be structurally bound. You shouldn't have this elaborate aestheticization of it. It should be schizophrenic by nature, and you should become an anarch where you have no sort of internal coherence. The coherence you get is by being incoherent. That is the best way to survive everything we've discussed and everything in the foreseeable future to come.
Damn straight. And if you want a visualization of this, see the Joker one more time, maybe on some acid. And if you're really feeling, how should I put it, motivational, open up a PDF. Don't put down your phone. Maybe don't use Tinder apps or whatever. Don't settle for this like shitty mediocrity. Like you can, maybe not as an individual or as a shitty community, do whatever. But if you really want to call yourself a fucking communist, like someone who actually believes in like some kind of an organic community that's not based on like pure contingent, self-righteous desires, then start acting like you're not fully submitting to the current order of things. And that will require some effort, right? But it's like Briggs said, it's not all hopeless. And like, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but to just discount anything intellectual as circle jerking or whatever, that might be the biggest limitation to your own channeling of the self in terms of everything else. There is a universality worth fighting for, right? But yeah, like you're going to have to figure that out on your own. I think the best part about doing this is that we try to ask better questions, not necessarily provide better answers, So I'm feeling more satisfied after you said that, Brig. Anyone has any final words?
I would say no, and maybe.
Well, that being said, I enjoyed joining in on this circle jerk. No, I'm joking. It was very, very enlightening being on this podcast with you guys. It was very good to talk to you.
Also, again, we want to thank our sponsors, which is the State Department of China in regards to surveillance, Tencent for owning Discord, of course, Ridge Wallets us they will sponsor us one day or another. Everybody is sponsored by Ridge Wallet, and of course, the Big Bill Hell Cars. Remember, if you want to get your wife fucked, take them to Big Bill Hell Cars.
Amen.
Don't get a fucking Cybertruck, dude. Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy New Year. I don't know when this podcast will be uploaded. It'll be the last one for this year. I think we've suffered enough.
I think it's going to be a two-parter, I think, because of the size, of the girth.
Oh, well...
No.
We're fucked.
We're fucked.
We're not like other girls.
We're not like other podcasts. It never ends. There are no episodes. It's just
remember,
one long schizophrenic conversation.
Remember, we're not kidding when we're joking.
Yeah, Ride the Tigers Brothers, HH.
Ride
This has
the
been all for
Tigers.
Pseud Central, Episode 3. See you when I see ya.
Have a good day, everybody.